What is up, my dudes? Welcome back to the fanfic reread project. Today, we are finishing our reread of Prophs 2.0. We are beginning with a Theon chapter, so let's jump right in. The clatter of silverware on china was the only thing that reverberated off of the stony walls of the small hall, and clinking. Sorry, small hall. Like, good lord, that's hard to say. The clatter of silverware on china was the only thing that reverberated off the stony walls of the small hall, and clinking sounds made the air shiver in a way that made Theon's teeth ache. Bran sat across from him, looking sour and absently spooning potatoes into his mouth, and he couldn't quite read Robb at the moment. The rest of the guardsmen were talking quietly amongst themselves, short of the few who'd been sent to Deepwood Motte. "What made you change your mind?" Robb asked him, setting down his wine. "After all this time." See, this is what I'm talking about with sort of like Sansa being missing. Apparently, it's been quote unquote a long time since Theon started getting the letters, but we literally first heard about it like 3 or 4 chapters ago. And like the last Bran chapter, I think in the Theon chapter where he learned about it, it said it had been 1 month since Jon left. Then in the Bran chapter, which was literally like 2 or 3 chapters later, it was like, it's been 2 months since everybody left. And it's like, why is time moving so quickly? At least it's nice that the story does tell us how long it's been, but also maybe with Sansa, things might not move so like rapidly. We'd get a little bit more of easing in. But anyway, Theon shrugged. "She's damn persistent," he told him. "It's like she doesn't even wait until she receives the decline before she sends another." His eyes flicked over at the sound of Bran loudly replacing his fork by his plate. "I could disappear anywhere right now. I'm sure they'd find me. I was gonna go someday." Okay, so weird small thing. This is apparently supposed to be a reference to Harry Potter and the way that, like, in the first book, when Harry is getting his Hogwarts letter, no matter where the Dudleys go, the Hogwarts letters show up. But it was very oblique. They both looked over this time at a particularly loud clink of silver on china. Robb raised an eyebrow. "Is something wrong, Bran?" "Can I be excused?" the boy asked. There was a desperate look in his eye. Half of his plate was untouched, but Robb nodded. "Maester, can you please escort my brother to his room?" Robb said. The old man nodded. "I want to go to the Godswood." Robb put a hand on his shoulder. "It's late. You can go tomorrow, first thing in the morning." Bran looked down, but he nodded and pushed back from the table. "He's upset about you leaving," he said once the door had closed. "I'm flattered," Theon said with a small smile. Robb shot him a look. "He's still scared of Lord Jaime?" "Maybe he's not so wrong," he said. He lowered his voice. "You remember the day we went on the hunt?" Of course. The feast that night had been burned into his mind. He'd been ecstatic about going south when he saw us off with Mother in the morning. That night, suddenly, Father says Bran is staying and he stops leaving the house. Something happened while we were gone, I'm almost certain. And Jaime hadn't come to the hunt with us. He trailed off. Robb eyed the others at the table warily. "We'll continue this later. Meet me in the Godswood when you finish." Robb excused himself from the table. Theon cleared his plate so he wouldn't raise suspicions. Anyone else notice how many chapters in this take place in the Godswood? It seems like every character in the North is going to the Godswood at least like once a chapter. I don't want to say it's like too much because so far most of the chapters that have been taking place in the Godswood have been pretty good. But it is just interesting how often both Theon and Bran end up in the Godswood. But moving on. He made his way through the shadowy halls of the castle and out of the front doors and into the gates of the Godswood. That was dumb. The moon wasn't even out and the place still shone. He found Robb by the heart with Grey Wind and Shadow. He couldn't help but gaze down at the spot where he knew Lady had been buried. The soil was indistinguishable from the rest now and thoroughly stained. "Why here?" Theon asked. "What I'm about to tell you wasn't supposed to leave my mother's chambers." Theon squinted at him. "And it's the first place I thought of." Theon nodded. If he was honest, it would have been his as well. "Before my mother left, she told Harwin and Roderick and I that her sister sent her a message telling her that she suspected the Lannisters had a hand in the death of her lord husband. That's what she went south to warn my father of." "You don't think it's any mistake that it's Lord Jaime Bran's afraid of?" Theon asked. Robb nodded. "I think my mother thought it too," he continued. "She never said it, but after I started to see it myself, it made too much sense. And my father's rode into a whole castle full of the men who might have killed the last hand." He looked down. "I just wish I knew what happened to him that day," he said in frustration. "What could have scared him so badly that he wouldn't leave the castle for a month? He doesn't climb anymore. He barely leaves the house, Robb said absently. I know, but he doesn't climb anymore, Theon said. The thought had come to him suddenly, but the farther he looked, the more it made sense. He used to climb like a damn squirrel. His mum and the maester used to do everything to try to get him to stop, you remember, and then one day he just stops. All Robb could say was, bloody hell, of course. What is he, Ron Weasley? Robb Weasley, oh god. I think someone's had it. He started, but he was cut off by the wolves taking off for the gates. He and Robb looked at each other, but followed after. The yard was alive with the sound of voices and the whinnying of horses. The caravan from Deepwood Mott had returned, and they seemed to be alight with news despite the hour. What's all this? Robb asked. My lord, Harwin started. During our return through the forest, the caravan was attacked by a band of wildlings. They were a poor lot, 2 men and a woman falling apart from frostbite. The 2 men are dead, but we took the woman. And why is that? Robb asked. She said she's seeing your brother. Dun, dun, dun. So it is funny that this thing that was mentioned all the way back in the last John chapter has become relevant again. I like that. It's almost like this is actually a decent story. So that chapter wasn't bad. I actually like that a lot. They're putting together the pieces of the mystery of what happened to Bran. Again, I do feel a little weird that the story plays this coy with what happened to Bran with the audience, because I feel like anyone who's reading this, if they haven't seen the show or read the books, knows anyway through cultural osmosis what happened to Bran. Otherwise, they wouldn't be reading this. So it's a little weird that we don't know, but they do, because you could have played with the cultural, or not the cultural, the irony, what is it called? The fucking dramatic irony, excuse me, of us knowing full well that Bran was pushed out of the tower, which the story comes very close to saying it, but he never comes outright and says it. But yeah, overall, this chapter is actually pretty good. Still don't understand the Melisandre thing, but at least it was useful in the story recently, so that's decent. So moving on, we now have an Arya chapter. Buckle in, because this Arya chapter is very long. Arya shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The dress she wore was a fine one, a gown made of soft gray silk embroidered with small white flowers that stuck so close to her body that she hadn't been able to hide the necklace, even beneath her small clothes. She never liked to look this fine, because every time she managed to mess herself and get in trouble. Sansa sat on the seat across from her, all done up in a blue satin gown with cinched sleeves and a jeweled brooch set in the frilly collar. Her hair was piled up on the top of her head, and she wore a hat trimmed with flowers and delicate netting. You wouldn't even think she'd ever been north of the neck by the look of her. She looked just like the ladies in the court. So even from what little we describe of this is not the type of dress that people in like A Song of Ice and Fire would wear, because that's a little bit more medieval, and this reads a little bit more like sometime in the 1800s. I'm not going to try and like pin it, but my brain wants me to say Victorian era, but that's kind of a long time. But yeah, so that's another sort of hint toward the tech jump, along with like the lights and photographs and stuff. They rode to the tourney with, oh god, you know what the problem is? I think I mentioned this in Prophs 1.0 when we were rereading that, but for some reason I, like a dumbass, used the same title to describe Septa Mordain and Maester Luwin. So they're both pegged as being religious people, despite the fact that Maester Luwin is not. And my brain keeps getting it mixed up because I see it and then I try to translate it to like 7 different words, and I can't. Like, it just gets me so confused. Every time I see it, I trip over this fucking word. But Septa Mordain. They rode to the tourney with Septa Mordain in a small carriage with white linen curtains that seemed to brighten the sunlight that came through the windows. Arya stared out the window as they rode out of the city walls. Banners from houses all over the continent, and some from beyond, waved in the breeze. If they're from beyond the continent, why would they have banners? Whatever. The crowd of the commoners was huge and loud, and shouts rung out all over the place. Arya hadn't been excited before, but now it was almost infectious. They sat in a place of high honor befitting the Hand himself, though he wasn't among them. When she looked, they weren't far from the royal family. The king and queen sat in the highest spot, with the princes and princess below them, all shining and fabulous looking, and the king holding a horn she guessed was filled with wine. The king's brother, Lord Renly— why does it give his entire title and place of birth? Like, what the heck? The king's brother, Lord Renly Baratheon of the Stormlands, sat only a short way from them and herself. He was a spitting image of his brother, except years younger and much fitter, the marks of the Baratheon slashing dark against his cheek where the king's beard obscured his. Neither of the queen's brothers were there, as the Kingslayer was riding in the jousts, and the imp had suddenly been taken by an urge to see the wall. What? What? Okay, hold on. Why? If Tyrion had been taken by an urge to see, why did he not go when he was in the north? He came north with them. Who goes all the way, almost 1,000 miles to visit someone, hundreds of miles to visit a person, and then comes back the entire hundreds of miles to where they live, and then goes, you know what I think? I think I should go see that thing that was a lot closer to the place we were like a month ago. Let's go back. Wee! Like, that's not an easy trip. Why didn't he just go when he was there and stay for a while and then not come back until after the tourney? Which is, what happened in the fucking book. Like, that is so weird. But, anyway. The lords and knights of Sansa's sweet songs rode onto the fields in armor each more fabulous than the last. All the knights of the Kingsguard rode in their scaled and enameled white. The Hound's brother, Sir Gregor Clegane the Mountain, thundered past on a warhorse even bigger than the one she'd seen her father ride. There seemed a million others, free riders and unsung knights and lesser lords and older squires. The Hound himself rode the lists in his ashen armor and dog's head helm, and the Kingslayer wore a gleaming suit of gold with a sword made the same way, with a cape of rich purple trimmed in gold. Jory Cassell rode for Winterfell in simple armor whose only decoration was the grey direwolf of her house. She thought he looked the noblest of them all. I don't understand why Jory is always referred to by his entire name by these people, like these kids haven't known him their entire life. I don't get that. It's always Jory Cassell. It's never just fucking Jory, or even Sir Jory, because I think Jory's a knight. He might not be. The jousts went on all day until the sun dipped below the horizon. Jory rode 3 jousts and was never unhorsed, but in his third the king judged his opponent's lance steadier and gave him the victory. Despite her wishes, the Kingslayer rode wonderfully, even taking down the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. I think what's really funny in this is that you can tell I never named Sir Barristan in Elvish, because his name is never said. He's always the Lord Commander. The Hound in the Mountain rode ferociously and seemed nigh unstoppable. Arya bit her lip to keep from laughing when one of the Kingsguard flew from his horse's back when the Hound unhorsed him, but it quelled in her throat when he turned his burning eyes on her. The Mountain seemed to ride down 1,000,000 men, and during one of his jousts a young man from the Mountains of the Moon was stabbed in the throat when his lance rode up his helm. People cried out when he fell from his horse. The boy hit the ground just a few feet from where they sat, his blood flowing from his neck like a river and staining his cloak sewn with the moons of the House Aaron. Attendants rushed onto the lists to carry the body away as some women in the crowds were taken to calm themselves. Arya watched the whole thing in a morbid trance, only roused when she heard her sister ask, "Is he dead?" in a flat voice. The Septa said yes, and Sansa looked down. They swept dirt over the blood, and the joust resumed. A free rider was disqualified when his lance gored the horse of Lord Jason Mallister of Seaguard. The lord changed his mount, but he was knocked off during his next joust by a black priest from Mur in the east. A lord from his seat on the bottom fork of the trident unseated the king's master of arms after he rode 3 jousts previously perfectly. By the end, the men who remained were the Mountain, the Hound, the Kingslayer, and Sir Loras Tyrell of the High Garden. He was a sight to be seen, Sir Loras, a young man about the same age as her brothers, with armor enameled in a way that threw rainbows across the green. His cape was clasped to his shoulders with gold and embroidered with the sigil of his house, the 5-pointed, I don't know what this flower is called, the 5-pointed something, in brilliant gold and green velvet. It's not a rose, though. One thing that's common throughout this is that every house has some type of mythical creature or mythical thing as their sigil, at least all of the great houses, not every single house. So his horse was draped in a blanket of roses in all colors, and after every victory he'd pick one and toss it to a maiden in the crowd. Even she was taken by it, though she still thought it was gaudy. In his last match, his lance split his opponent's shield in two and flung him from his horse. He made his way around the lists as the crowds cheered for him. He'd become a favorite as the day went on. When he stopped this time, it was in front of them. Her eyes went wide, and the Septa let out a small gasp. The rose he plucked from the blanket was deep red this time, not like the white she'd seen before. She never said they were white. He reached over the railing to her sister. "My lady," he said, removing his helm, "no victory is half as beautiful as you." If she could see him, Arya thought, she would be struck dumb by his curling blonde hair and grassy green eyes. The delicate marks of the Tyrells graced the area above his left brow. Sansa smiled graciously as she took it from him, not even giggling like the older maidens had. Before he rode off, she saw his eyes flick up towards someone behind them, and she almost turned to see who before she remembered herself. Her sister held the thing dearly to her heart when a man approached them from the stair. "You must be one of her daughters," he said in a thin but authentic lingua de plata. Again, this accent is stupid. At least this time, this guy's from the place where that accent would be from, so His dark hair had grayed on the sides, and his goatee tipped a mouth with a sly look to it. There's no mistaking the Tullys. Yes, I'm Sansa Stark, her sister said. And you're Lord Peter Baelish of the Small Council, if I'm not mistaken? He smirked, and I haven't even had the honor. I've heard, she said with a small smile of her own. She always did. The man had started to say something else, but the king stood and declared that the last 3 jousts would be done on the morrow. The man left them after that. See, the weird thing is that in the books, Peter comes up and he's like, wow. He says, like, basically that same thing, even though Sansa's response is a little bit different, because she hadn't heard. But then he, like, touches her face very briefly and then leaves. So you get like a weird kind of like creepy like, moment that hints at Peter's later preoccupation with Sansa as a replacement goldfish for Cat. In the show, Peter shows up a lot earlier, and he is there for the entirety of this stuff. And he's even the one who ends up with the Hound story of telling Sansa and Arya, in this case, about what happened to the Hound. At least I think Arya was there for this part in the show. She definitely was there for part of it, where in the books, I don't think she was present for either day of the tourney. But anyway. Their carriage was brought back for them, and they rode to the shores of the Blackwater for the feast. Tables and benches had been laid in the grass under a canopy strung with banners in the colors of the king and her house as well. Paper lanterns and small stained glasses holding candles cast the place in a soft and warm light. They were sat in a place of honor right next to where the king sat. The queen was curiously absent. On a raised dais like the one at the front of the great hall in Winterfell where her parents sat, and it gave them a perfect view of the Blackwater over the other tables. She happily awaited the plates for the meal until a snatch of golden red caught her eye. Her stomach clenched as Prince Joffrey made his way over to them, settling on Sansa's other side. She kept her eyes forward so not to meet with him. The servants came past her a million times carrying all kinds of savory meats and vegetables she actually wasn't opposed to eating. They filled her plate with a salad of sweet and icy lettuce topped with frozen grapes and chilled apple slices drizzled with orange and lemon juice. Then came baked trout from the river and clams and mussels from the Blackwater and red crabs from the Bay of Ice and blue crabs from the waters where the white knife emptied into the bite, which she'd had at home before, and sea slugs, which she heard the prince say were steamed and soft-roasted the way they made them in the king's homeland, and she was afraid to eat because they were slugs, but turned out to be delicious. Oh my god, that sentence is so long. It's like that on purpose, though. Let me finish this paragraph and then we'll talk about that. By the time they brought the sweetbread and cakes, she was so stuffed she could only bite at a few sugared cookies. So most of that paragraph is literally one sentence. I think they filled her plate with a salad of sweet and icy lettuce. That's one sentence. And then after that, from then came baked trout all the way down to the bit about the slugs, that is one sentence. Like, however, again, this is on purpose because what I was trying to do was show just how much food there was by having Arya's inner monologue list off like almost breathlessly, quote unquote, so many different types of foods. So everything is in one sentence. There are no commas. It's supposed to be like, and they had red crabs and they had blue crabs and they had slugs and they were slugs, but they were good. And then they had, it's supposed to be like that. However, it's just hard to read. So it doesn't come across as well. There was one other time I tried to do this, and we'll see how that one works. I remember once saying that this time was actually more successful than that time, but I think in general this device is kind of flawed because it just seems like one big run-on sentence and you're not really going to understand that. But moving on. The prince was nothing but courteous to her sister through the night and helped her through her meal when he might. He only looked her way once, and he nodded at her politely when he did. She noticed that the king's brother sat down with Sir Loras and spoke to him and a girl that looked remarkably like him over glasses of wine, and she saw the kingslayer talking the Lord Commander's ear off as the night went on. The king took goblet after goblet of wine, and then she heard him say, "I believe I'm starting the cloud, dear girl. Take this wine and bring me a beer." That's a fun moment. She gazed out over the Blackwater, watching the moon reflect distantly in the darkened waters as the yellow pinpricks of light of the Dragonstone in the distance. That doesn't make sense, but whatever. "Why isn't he here?" she suddenly asked. "The king's other brother." My uncle's a busy man," she heard the prince say. She looked deceptive, but she dozed off on her other side. "He barely has time to leave the castle, let alone leave the island." He shrugged, or at least that's what they tell me. I think what interests me the most about this is that these mentions of Stannis aren't just kind of like one-off or like just random mentions like, oh yeah, Stannis exists, you know that. They both very conspicuously mention the fact that Stannis is like, it's him being conspicuously absent, or the statement very notably saying like, oh, Stannis never leaves his castle, almost like that's important or something. I wonder why. Not that we'll find out here, but soon the moon was high in the sky and she was starting to doze herself. She wanted to go back to the castle, but she had no escort, and her sister was just as happy as she could be with the prince. She suddenly wished for her father. It's late, she heard someone say behind her. She tensed at the sound of the Kingslayer's voice. Would you two be needing an escort back to the castle? Yes, Arya said tightly. That would be most kind, Sansa said after. We'd be glad for the protection. I'll take them, the prince started, but his uncle stopped him. That's noble of you, nephew, but your other uncle wants to see you. The prince mumbled an apology to her sister and rose from the table. I'll call for Sandor Clegane. She even saw her sister tense at that, but before he could say anything else, another voice spoke behind them. Don't worry him with such a thing, my lord, Lord Peter said. She hoped her sigh wasn't audible. I'll do it myself. He took Sansa by the arm, and she followed as he walked them down the steps and back to the carriages. Oh, how noble, Peter. She kept her eyes at the windows as they rode back, as something about Lord Baelish put her on edge. Her sister made polite small talk with him and discussed the day's events. Sir Gregor rode fiercely, Sansa said. He did, the lord agreed. He's a terror, that one, even outside of the lists. What do you mean, my lord? Her sister asked. My child, you might have heard, but the hound has a scar that mars the right side of his face. Oh yeah, we might have heard. It's very clearly there. Oh shit, I keep forgetting Sansa can't see! Damn! No! Oh my god, now I'm Arya. Fuck. Sorry about that, Jesus. It's a hideous thing, and I'm shocked he still has his eye. They say his brother was the one that gave it to him, Sir Gregor, he told her. A spat as children that ended with him holding Sandor's face in hot coals, and over a toy as well. He shook his head. A shame. Sansa had gone pale, making her red freckles stand out on her skin. I'd best not repeat that to anyone, he added suddenly. I'm sure the mountain would not be happy if he knew. They rode the rest of the way back in complete silence. Okay, so let's talk about this. So, clearly this moment is meant to mimic the moment in the show where Peter tells Sansa about Sandor's backstory. However, the choice to replicate that instead of doing the thing in the book where the Hound actually does it, especially because here that is referenced, and he's like, I'll call for the Hound, and Peter is like, no, I'll do it, which that choice doesn't make sense. It makes sense that Peter would be like, no, I'll do it. I'll be alone with the 12. I mean, like, that's not weird, but the decision to copy the show's decision to have Peter tell this story, especially when, unlike the show, I didn't cut out the feast after the thing, which is the reason why I think they changed that. It's really weird because it doesn't make as much sense for Peter to tell Sansa this story. Yes, I know the show made this choice because they wouldn't have a chance for the Hound to actually speak to Sansa, like, on screen. But the impact of the story changes when it's not Sandor telling Sansa himself, because that's supposed to be, like, not a bonding moment between them, but it's an important moment in their budding I feel weird calling it a relationship, but it's a moment in their dynamic. It's very important, you know? So taking that away is already problematic, but taking it away here, where there's no reason to take it away, is even more so. Like, it's to the point where in the GOT rewrite, I actually put it back in. Because I was like, this moment's too important to change. Even if it's like a certain someone is still there, Arya. I still need that moment for the development of the relationship between Sandor and Sansa. And you can also use it as a moment for the development between the dynamic of Sandor and Arya if you need to. I don't know if that's the best choice, but I'm doing it. But yeah, it's just very weird that that's here. And it just seems kind of random for Peter to just throw that out there. Like, is he trying to scare them? It's different when it's Sandor, you know? But anyway. Despite the morbid story, Arya slept sound as a rock that night and was woken early in the morning for the jousts. The Septa had fallen quote-unquote ill, so she wasn't forced into something nearly as fancy as the day before, just a simple gray dress made in taffeta. Before she left the room, she slipped the pendant on and hid it between her dress and her small clothes. One of the Queen's own ladies-in-waiting escorted them to the lists, a cousin of hers that bore all the features that her family was known for. Will the Queen be attending today? Sansa asked her politely in the carriage. I know she was upset by the death of that poor knight. She won't, unfortunately, she replied in a tight lingua de plata like the Kingslayers. My cousin has no stomach for blood. Sir Gregor's writing is a bit too intense for her, poor thing. I feel like if you poke Cersei too hard in this, she would just like fall to pieces. But at least in this, I can understand why she might not want to see that again. When they arrived, she saw that the seat next to the king was instead filled by his brother, his red cloak wreathed with silver antlers and clasped at his shoulder. Oh, that's kind of a look. The king's face seemed already reddened from his goblet. The queen's cousin left them for the other ladies in waiting, but soon her father found his way to them. She felt like she hadn't seen him in ages, and he didn't look as if he'd slept decently. He seems so much busier these days. It is interesting that Renly is allowed to sit, not like allowed, because he's the king's brother, but like it's interesting that Renly is sitting in the box with him. Because, as you know in the books, Renly Stannis and Robert don't get along with each other at all. So it's always been a element of this specific story in Prophs, however, that Renly gets along with both of his brothers much better than they get along with each other. Even though, depending on which version it is, he's still not like super close, but I think he is usually close to Robert, but not super duper close, because Robert has sort of an abrasive personality and keeps getting on Renly for daring to not like hunting, you know. But then in later versions, like in the current version of Prophs, he's much closer to Stannis for reasons that if I do ever actually write it will become very obvious. But yeah, that's always an interesting little like tidbit in the story. And it makes you wonder more about like, well, where is Stannis? Why is he always on the island? I don't get it. 100 golden dragons on Lord Lannister, Lord Baelish said loudly as the Kingslayer entered the lists. He was in the same golden armor he'd worn previous, but now his helm was the head of a lion, and gold as the Maltara about his purple cloak, sure. His horse was draped in a blanket of golden satin. That's a lot of gold. Very gaudy. Done, she heard someone say. His voice curled like the king's, but without the intrusion of the lengua de plata, so she assumed it was Lord Baratheon. The hound has a hungry look about him. Even a dog knows better not to bite the hand that feeds him, Lord Baelish responded. The hound himself rode into the lists with his ashen armor and a simple cape of grey. His voice curled like the king's, but without the intrusion of the lengua de plata, so that's a little confusing. See, this is what I'm talking about. If the lengua de plata is an accent, and it's not the only accent in the South, then why does Sam have it when he's from the Reach? I don't get it. If the Stormlands has a specific accent, why is it the rest of Westeros has a different one? I am so confused right now. Why does Jaime and Peter Baelish and Samwell Tarly all have the same fucking accent that makes no goddamn sense? Good lord, this is something that got fixed in other later versions of Prophs. In Prophs 3.0, this was sort of resolved, even though it had its own problems, but at least each region had its own accent, so if we were going to do that, it makes more sense. And then Prophs 4.0 solved the problem even further. After the men took their places and set their lances, they took off at each other. Oh, that's a very Batman Begins type sentence. The Kingslayer was quick as lightning to miss the hound's lance, while his shattered against the dog's head shield. The hound only just kept his seat and rode back for the second bout, while the Kingslayer went back for a new lance. On their second pass, however, the hound seemed to catch the Kingslayer's game. There was an explosion of splinters, and the Kingslayer fell to the ground with a clang. Sansa lifted her head a bit. I knew the hound would win. Arya couldn't help but wonder how she could tell. Okay, now this is a situation where I feel like Arya wondering that actually fucking makes sense. It's not like, how did Sansa know that Joffrey was being attacked by a dog when you could clearly hear dog growls and Joffrey yelling? It's like, if you just hear and like people and like clang, 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 yeah, it's a little weird to tell like which one is the hound and which one. Like that makes way more sense. In all these chapters, this is the first time that one of those has actually made sense, so that's nice, I guess. If you know who's going to win the next bout, please speak up, sweetling, before Lord Renly cleans my pockets. That's Peter saying that. I don't know why there's no dialogue tag there. She saw her father smile. When the Kingslayer got to his feet, his helm had been twisted about his head and he couldn't get it off. The commons were pointing and laughing, and the only thing keeping Arya from bursting out herself was the thought of upsetting her father. She could hear the king laughing over them all. Shame the imp took off to the mountains, Lord Renly said. I would have won twice as much. Oh, foreshadowing. An attendant led the Kingslayer off the field and presumably to a blacksmith. The crowd began to calm as Sir Gregor Clegane took the field. No wonder they called him a mountain, she thought. The man made his horse look like a pony. She let out a gasp when she saw Sir Loras enter the lists. He looked like a vision in his silver armor, and roses had been woven into his cape, which was clasped to his shoulders with lavade molded from gold. Why did they put him up against the mountain? He wouldn't stand a chance. Why the fuck does Loris keep wearing roses if his sigil is not a rose? That doesn't really make sense. Like, if it's because, oh, they're from the Reach and it's a garden, then why wouldn't he wear a bunch of flowers? That's very strange. I understand that this, like, mythical flower probably doesn't exist in real life, or if it does, it's very hard to find and rare, so you can't just go picking a bunch of them and putting them on your, thing, but, like, it's very strange. Sansa took their father by the arm. "He won't be hurt, will he?" she asked him. She had pinned the rose he'd given her to her chest. "The lances split on impact," he told her, "so no one is hurt." But she remembered the young knight the mountain jousted the day before, and she wasn't so sure. Sir Gregor's horse seemed to be acting out, snorting and hoofing at the ground. Sir Loris seemed none too worried, however, as he saluted the king and dropped his visor. When they charged at each other, the mountain's warhorse ran wild and off-kilter, while Sir Loris's silver mare was smooth as the summer breeze. The mountain and his horse went to the ground in an avalanche of splinters, while the silver mare trotted to a stop on the other end, her rider unhurt. The commons went wild as Sir Loris removed his helm and flashed a pearly smile. Sir Gregor, however, got to his feet and yelled for his squire. Arya could see the fire in his eyes as the boy passed him his sword. The next thing she knew, the horse's head was lying on the ground. Shouts went up from the crowd as the mountain turned his sword on Sir Loris. The silver mare reared when it scented blood, and the knight was calling for his own sword, but the mountain struck him in the chest and knocked him to the dirt. Before he could land a killing blow, another sword blocked his own, and then the hound was on the field, and they were fighting in a fury. The commons screamed, and the lords and ladies let out fervent gasps, and her sister was in tears, and hot metal was burning against her chest through cotton, and it all happened so fast that Arya felt her head was spinning. "Stop this madness, in the name of your king." And then it was all over. The hound fell to a knee, and his brother shoved his sword into the ground, absolutely fuming. Every member of the Kingsguard was on his feet. The mountain said not a word as he stomped off the field, and his squire was forced to wrench the sword from the dirt by himself. Sir Loris returned to the field and gave the hound the victory, simply lifting his hand in the air to the cheers of the commons. So let's pause there. The commons screamed, and the lords and the ladies. That sentence was another instance where I tried to delete the commas to get that breathless feeling. And actually, because it's not as long, I was able to sort of read it the way it was meant to be read, and that one worked. But when it's like such a long description and you're going through like 7 different kinds of food, it's really hard to keep that up. So I would say maybe in small doses this kind of works, but this is a flawed device. However, with me being able to read it, the effect actually does come off really nicely and stop with the madness. Stop this madness in the name of your king, and then it's all over. It really does get that feeling of like everything's happening so fast, you know? But moving on, I cannot believe we're still reading this goddamn chapter. Jesus. Her father escorted them to the fields for the melee in a crowd of the high lords and ladies, right along with the king himself. "I swear the boy must have known the mare was in heat," Lord Baelish said behind her. "You'd think he'd have planned it. A clever trick, I think." "There's no honor in tricks," the Lord Commander said tightly. She found that unsurprising from a man of the Kingsguard. Maybe not," Lord Baratheon said, "but there are 20,000 golden dragons." The melees went on for hours, right up until nightfall again. She watched men bloody and break and bruise each other with a twisted fascination. By the end, only the Black Priest of Myr stood, a man whose name she couldn't quite pronounce, who fought with a sword of black dragon glass that cut through bone like air. 3 men lost fingers to him. There was also a smashed collarbone and a shattered knee, a cut that had to be stitched and thankfully wasn't infected, and enough purpled fingers and limbs to shake a stick at. So, briefly, don't ask me why I changed it so that R'hllor, instead of being like a god of light and fire, was a god of darkness. It's very, very strange. This is something that I kind of don't get in multiple versions. While, at the very least, sometimes changes to the religion do justify themselves in the case of the changes that I've made to the faith of the old gods. Things like R'hllor being turned into a god of darkness and the 7 being written out in later versions and replaced with worship of like a sun god. It's kind of like, why? What is the point of that? It just seems like a change for the sake of a change, which kind of is like, if it's not something that actually helps the story along, what's the point, you know? But moving on. The feast that night was just as good as the one previous. She was shocked at the fact that they were able to make another salad that she didn't mind eating, and then they filled her plate with roasted wild beef and mashed potatoes with cranberry gravy and grilled salmon basted in orange and butter paste. She refused a few of the other courses so she could eat dessert, and had chocolate cake frosted with chocolate and mint and ice cream with chunks of strawberry and cherry in it. She was led back to her room full and happier than she'd been in a long time. Her father left her as soon as she entered the room, however, which did upset her a bit. She wanted to go to sleep happy, however, so she put it out of her mind and changed into her nightgown and went to sleep with the feeling of warm metal against her heart. And that's the end of that chapter. Good God. Oh my God. That was so long. Okay, so the reason why this chapter is so long, for those of you who have not read the book, is because in the book, this is 2 chapters. One is Sansa's and one is Ned's. So I understand writing one from Arya's POV. However, this is another section where Sansa having a POV would be very helpful, because then you could split the work of this chapter and have Sansa take the chapter that was supposed to be Ned's POV, so it's still a different perspective on the events. And then Arya takes Sansa's, giving us a different perspective on the first day. Boom, boom, done. I feel like back in the day, because this is a thing that comes up in multiple stories, I had this tendency to write really, really long chapters and just be really happy. I'm like, oh my God, it's so many words. Wow. But then never really stop and realize that sometimes a chapter doesn't need to be long. Sometimes things can be short, and sometimes things are a certain length for a reason. Because this isn't the only story where there is a chapter of this length in it. And of course, I have shit with long chapters now. Cat 3 in the GOT rewrite is over 3,000 words, I think. But, like, number one, I'm going to rewrite the GOT rewrite, so we won't have to see that anymore. It's almost like that chapter might be too long. But in other older stories, in the original draft of Curse of the Black Pearl, my Pirates of the Caribbean fanfic, the chapters of 10, 11, and 12 were originally all one chapter, and it was like 3,000 something words. There is a chapter in Lego Story that at one point was 4,000 words and was sort of shortened over the years. Lego Story in general just has a lot of really long chapters. Like, there isn't a single chapter in Lego Story that's under, I think, 1,500 words. But yeah, like, I don't know why this chapter is so long, but I don't know how I feel about it either. To give slightly more in-depth thoughts, because I don't have a lot to say, but I am very, about this chapter. I was kind of looking forward to reading it. Maybe not looking forward is the right word, but I wanted to read this chapter because I wanted to see if it held up, and I don't think it did. I think what's weird is that for all of the fucking words in this chapter, there isn't that much detail. And I know, especially because of how long this is, we can't get a detailed play-by-play of what happens in each joust, you know? But I still feel like there could have been more. There were a lot of characters who were just unnamed. I feel like if I hadn't bothered with the Elvish, I could have avoided that. It kind of felt like we just got a brief synopsis of everything that happened. And then occasionally that synopsis would be broken by an actual moment in the plot, like the thing when Peter took them back to the castle or things like that. But there weren't enough of those moments. Overall, I guess it's passable, but it's not the best. It sucks because Arya's last 2 chapters haven't been my fave, but Arya had one really good chapter that I read a few episodes ago, and I'm like, what happened to this? Moving on, so now we are on the last chapter. This is pretty short because it's not finished. So this is Bran's chapter. Bran hovered over the glassy pool, the chilly breeze distorting the reflections that appeared in its surface. He swore he'd seen the tiny white light again, but just as he looked, the thing had flickered out. For the life of him, he couldn't figure the little thing out. It just came and went as it pleased, which wasn't normal for a necklace, he was sure. He was sure. And almost always in that same pool. He was almost tempted to wade in and see if it might be a portal, but it was too cold, and those kinds of things only happen in stories. To Bran's credit here, I don't think it's necessarily the pond making the necklace disappear, because as we've seen, and this is, of course, Bran doesn't know this, but we know that the necklace disappeared out of Arya's trunk and ended up in the floor of her room without her realizing, never having touched the Godswood once. So it's definitely the necklace and not the pond. Still questioning why a teleporting hot necklace exists in this. Oh Jesus, it's about to storm. Oh no. All right, I gotta finish this episode very quickly. I'm still unsure as to why a teleporting hot necklace exists in this story and why the necklace teleports, because the hot part at least I understand. But yeah, it's here. So anyway, it felt like the Godswood was the only constant in his life. It's the only constant in my life at this point. It couldn't leave the castle, and neither would he. Robb had joked that Bran had merely swapped his room for the wood, but it was the only place outside of the castle itself that he felt safe. The haunting feeling it once held had dissipated, and he was even trying to climb again. Maybe someday he'd feel as comfortable outside of the walls, but for now this would do. "What are you doing down there, lordling?" He straightened suddenly to find the wilding woman Osha standing on the other side of the pool. Summer let out a snarl, but Bran placed a hand on his head and he calmed. She seemed tall as a tree, with a long face and dark hair that tangled upon her head. She'd been sent to the kitchens after her questioning. She couldn't tell them much, except that her and some men she'd been traveling with had run into John in the gorge and his wolf had killed 2 of them. "Nothing," is what he finally told her. "I just thought I saw something. What are you doing out here?" "I'm allowed my prayers when I need them. We keep the old gods, too, above the wall. We come from the first men, too." "Oh." He'd heard about that, but all the stories of the wildings he'd heard didn't paint them as men who prayed, let alone kept gods. "I'd best be going. There's dishes that need washing." She turned for the gates, the manacles at her ankles clinking softly as she moved. "Wait!" She stopped. "There was a necklace in here," he ventured. "In the water?" she asked. He nodded warily. "Don't sound like the kind of thing that would be in there." "I know, but we found it here. Now it's gone again." "Gone?" Ocean kneeled down by the pool, and Bran and Summer did the same. "Yes, it comes and it goes. Once I found it in the house, but then I gave it to my brother, and he'd thrown it in the pool again. I saw it down there just now, but it's gone again." He stopped, then thought a moment. "Or maybe it just stopped glowing, but I've never seen it do that." Osha had a strange look on her face. "You say you found a glowing necklace that just comes and goes as it please?" He nodded, and then he sighed. "If I hadn't held it, I wouldn't believe me either." "Oh, but I do, lordling. The gods work in this place." And that is the end of that chapter. So, I can't really give an assessment on that. That chapter's too short. But, again, every person in Winterfell has 1 visit to the God's Wood per chapter. Good God. And this is a thing that, again, like I said, is a constant throughout every version of prophs. Even when I stopped doing prophs as a prose piece and started trying to make it into a television series, a lot of the scenes involving Robb and Theon and Bran and even Kat, when she, spoilers, came back up north, they were in the Godswood. It was a lot of scenes of them in the Godswood, but there kind of is a thematic reason for that. It's just when you keep reading it, it does stick out. Like, man, they sure do keep going to the Godswood a lot. But like I said, there was a reason for it in this story. I guess what we read of that was fine. It wasn't anything like super offensive or anything like that. Nothing stood out to me as being like wildly like bad or pointless or anything. It seemed like this chapter was going somewhere interesting. We were gonna maybe get a different perspective on all this magical shit happening, talking to someone who's from north of the wall. But yeah, so final thoughts on prophs overall. I am surprised. It's hard giving thoughts because, and I may have mentioned this when I came back, but there is a wide gap between when I recorded the 2nd and 3rd episodes. At least, I think it might be like 2-ish months. So I don't remember the first few chapters that clearly. However, what I will say is what I do know that I've read recently has been surprisingly good. I am genuinely surprised by this story and its quality. Is it the best thing ever? Clearly not. Is it better than the other reread that I was doing just recently? Hell yeah. And that's what surprises me the most, because as I mentioned, I think in episode 3, I just finished the reread for Batman Begins. But I came away from that story not disappointed, but very underwhelmed. And then this story, which I think I started around the time that I finished Batman Begins, but was basically written later, and not that much later though, is a lot better. Like, at least parts of it are. There are, like, it has its rough patches. The part where it inexplicably has 2 Theon and Arya chapters that repeat their premises is very, very strange. But I think out of everything, that is kind of the roughest part. The beginning's a little bit rough, but once you get down to that Bran chapter after those 4 Arya and Theon chapters, the story's pretty solid. And I would say even Jon's first chapter is pretty interesting because it's a perspective that we aren't like expecting. It's not something you've seen in the show at the very least. But with the exception of like the Arya chapters that follow very closely to the plot of the book chapters they're based off of, which were both kind of just like, not bad, but kind of just like there's nothing here that I haven't seen already. Everything else was surprisingly good, very engaging, like storytelling. That one John chapter that had action in it was surprisingly well written. And it's like, whoa, I'm keeping up with this and I'm kind of like invested. Wow. And that surprises me. But I think I keep forgetting when I actually wrote this story, because this story is actually a contemporary of The Dark Knight Rises, not Batman Begins. So while it has a lot of the same quirks as both of those stories, because they were written only within, like, I finished one and like 3 weeks later I was starting the other one. Much like The Dark Knight Rises, I had taken a creative writing class around the time that I started writing both of these stories, so they were both affected by it, and I think you can definitely see that here. Because again, this is really not that bad. And it looked like there was some interesting stuff going on. I will say that there were definitely some unnecessary elements. The story had some weird like things in it that I'm not entirely sure what I meant to do with, like the whole Melisandre and Theon bit, the necklace, the sword. I don't know why Needle was suddenly a magical sword and not just given to her by John. I feel like that defeats the purpose. But again, I think I was just like really experimenting still with fic at this time. So I was working my way through different types of tropes and devices and stuff and just seeing like what I could do, what I thought was interesting. I was experimenting. So to that extent, I understand why it's there, but it is funny that I never came back and like tone that stuff down, but I guess I just moved on to a different version after this. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. I usually don't insert into my final thoughts because I don't want to take perspectives from way outside of when I read it and put them in, but I really do feel like I miss some things in the final thoughts for this series as a whole. Because yes, this was surprisingly enjoyable and the quality was better than what I was expecting at the time. However, I feel like in my, maybe not rush, but in my push to gush about how much better this was than Batman Begins, I kind of missed a few critiques that really emphasize why this story was actually not that good and it's just good in comparison. In particular, the biggest one is the lack of POV characters in comparison to the source material. So I'm sure I went over this in an earlier episode, at least I think I did, but I have mentioned multiple times that there are a lot of POV characters missing, and that's because during the story I kind of only wanted to focus on the child characters, and then Sansa got cut as a POV because I was afraid of miswriting her disability. So that only left us with 4 POV characters. Due to that, we missed a lot of stuff. And not only does it mess up the pacing, which I definitely did bring up during this episode, but it also messes up the progression of the narrative. Because as you guys know, there's an entire, like, plot of A Song of Ice and Fire that happens mainly in King's Landing regarding the true parentage of Robert's children. That happens completely off screen, and the only hints we really get toward it happen in Bran's chapters of all things, because he interacts with his mom. Due to Ned kind of not shutting his kids out, but being shut away from his kids, Arya is just kind of floating around, which is another issue that I'm about to bring up, but Arya is just kind of floating around doing her own thing, and we have no even hints that there is something else going on and that there seems to be some unrest in, like, the Red Keep, you know, outside of, oh, her dad's been working a lot. Like, she mentions a lot that her dad's been working a lot and he seems stressed out, but that's it. We have no indication of why. Now, sure, you could say, oh, you can combine the details of like Bran's chapters with what is seen in Arya's chapters, but I think the problem is that there's just so little seen in Arya's chapters. And I feel like if Sansa had been a POV character, this may have been mitigated, but the big problem is more so that there's no way to properly cover the issues that come up in Ned's chapters or Kat's chapters without either of those characters having a POV. That's just what it is, you know? The other thing too is that I feel like Arya did not have a character arc compared to the other characters, and I think this is why Arya, compared to the other ones, has fewer chapters that I liked, because even in Bran's chapters that don't push any type of plot forward, there is a lot of introspection about like everything that's going on and people leaving home and how you have to do that, or that time that he was like pondering about his feelings on death. There's lots of that stuff. Theon's chapters have that too. Arya just kind of seems to be a viewpoint for certain events that happen, whether those events are altered versions of book events or like original events or just straight up things that happen in the book. She doesn't seem to be reacting to that in a way that shapes her character at all. She's just there. I think the tourney is a good example of that because we get this entire like blow by blow of the tourney, but we don't really get to hear about Arya's feelings about things except at very like minute moments. So she's like, oh, I don't know about that or something like that, but it doesn't play into any type of character thing, which is weird because the tourney, at least the one half of the tourney, was kind of a big thing in Sansa's character arc in the first book. So just in general, I understand probably why I glossed over a lot of the criticisms that I could have had because I was like, well, I made them all already, but I feel like I should have brought some of this stuff up because, and I know coming from the future, this is not like, I don't want to just walk over everything I said because that stuff was true at the moment, but looking back on this stuff, outside of like that one John chapter and some of the chapters that I did enjoy, this shit ain't that good. It's really not. And I think part of it too is just because I'm re-listening to it, so I'm coming from like a different place. Like I said, I'm coming from the future, but I still think I just should have brought this stuff up so we could even out the actual critiques with the praise, you know, and get a fuller picture of my thoughts on this. But anyway, so that is the end. I'm just going to redo the outro because my old outros fucking suck. So the next reread is going to be the first round of drafts for Keep Breathing, which is a collection of Marvel fanfics. You'll see what it is when we get there, so next week. But if you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe to the channel and you'll be updated on when that next episode comes out, or whatever the new episode is when you are listening to this. It would also be super helpful if you guys could check out my backlog and you can catch up on this series as well as checking out other rereads that I've done. I am going to leave a link to the first prophs reread for prophs 1.0 in the description. And if you go to my page, you can find the rereads for the Batman stories that I talked about, as well as the Hunger Games. So like I said, I will see you next episode for Keep Breathing Drafts Part 1. Bye!